In virtually every university philosophy department from sea to shining sea, in virtually every course syllabus, in virtually every assignment description on the syllabus, the same word consistently appears and reappears again and again. Often italicized for emphasis, this word is what distinguishes a properly philosophical attitude and assessment from the mere repetition of opinions. When we trainees in the art of a life wisely lived are assigned a task, usually one of writing, we are expected to undertake that task critically. Write a critical reflection on so-and-so's ideas. Present your critical evaluation of such and such. But this requirement can sometimes be daunting, especially when the subject matter to be critically engaged is signed by one of those canonized names synonymous with philosophy itself. If we're working with the great works of some of the greatest minds of all time, shouldn't we begin with more humility, suspending our own standards of truth and validity in order to be capable of more sympathetically grasping and understanding those of the immortal author? Shouldn't a critical assessment be first and foremost a self-critical assessment? One in which I put myself at stake in an inquiry guided by minds greater than my own, to which I submit myself. Indeed, university professors are usually well aware of the dialectic at play in a philosophical education between the presupposed standards a student brings to an inquiry on the one hand, and those of the authors to be critically engaged on the other hand. The critical task professors invite students into will often involve dialectically working through these perhaps opposing criteria of critical justification. The best teachers certainly recognize that if philosophical critique merely consists in the application of standardized methods and rules of thinking that we've inherited, or are in the process of inheriting as philosophical trainees working in the academic milieu, then philosophical thought will consequently become nothing more than the formalized repetition of what is already presupposed as valid according to conventional standards of critique. Essential to the critical task, then, and to a philosophical education, is for those of us who engage with the history of ideas to be willing to put ourselves at stake in the inquiry, and that in two senses. First, we put ourselves at stake by being willing to abandon our own standards of judgment in order to honestly attempt to grasp and express those of another. But secondly, paradoxically, we must also put ourselves at stake precisely by trusting our critical capacity to comprehend and render judgments concerning even those great philosophers whose names are to us as luminous beacons of truth amidst the dark uncertainty of our perennial stupidity. If everything is at stake in the inquiry, writes today's guest, there can be no fixed standpoint from which critique occurs. Rather, the criteria of the investigation must be themselves open to transformation. And with the criteria, also we who establish them. Such is the procedure of G.W.F. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel's effort to achieve genuine critique requires putting at stake both the very possibility of philosophy and our criteria for determining what counts as genuine philosophical knowledge. And this effort issues in his distinctive self-transformational philosophical procedure. A procedure, or path, not of mastery and self-certainty, but of self-loss, alienation, and despair. This is Philosophy for the People. I'm your host, Nathan Wiley, here with producer Nick Cook.
Hello.
In today's episode, we discuss critical thinking and self-transformation, lessons from Hegel, with Associate Professor and Coordinator of the Certificate in Ethics, Values, and Society at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Dr. William Bristow. Dr. Bristow, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here.
So Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit occupies a monumental place in the canon of Western philosophical classics. Published in 1807, it is a modern classic of German idealism in the decades following Immanuel Kant. Like Kant's Critique of Pure Reason before it, The phenomenology addresses itself to crisis in the wake of European Enlightenment regarding the possibility of metaphysics. Dr. Bristow, you've written the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on the Enlightenment, so could you perhaps begin by enlightening us on how significant metaphysics was seen to be for philosophy at the dawn of the Enlightenment, and how the Enlightenment began to cast doubt on the legitimacy of metaphysical claims in philosophy?
Yes. So yeah, as you referenced there, at the beginning of the period of the Enlightenment, metaphysics is. I mean, if you think of, for example, the work of Descartes and followers of Descartes or of Spinoza, it's attempting to establish metaphysics as first philosophy, and in a kind of revolutionary way relative to previous philosophy. But with the development of empiricism, there gets to be a general suspicion against the possibility of metaphysics in, for example, John Locke or David Hume, and in kind of common sense philosophy in Scotland. There's more of a mistrust of this attempt to know supersensible objects. So I think that is a kind of trajectory within the Enlightenment period. Is there's a progressive suspicion that grows with respect to the enterprise of metaphysics as kind of empirical science gains its own footing, so to speak, and can establish its claims, without the validation of metaphysics. And metaphysics proves itself to be what Kant called a battlefield of endless controversy, not able to establish itself as a science. There's the general kind of ambition to do without metaphysics altogether.
So you mentioned that metaphysics took as its object supersensible objects. So what sorts of objects are these? They're to be contrasted with those objects of thought proper to the empiricists.
Right. In Kant, and perhaps I was kind of channeling a bit of Kant there, the supersensible objects are God, the soul, and the world as a whole. The world as an entirety, and which is associated with, for him, with the concept of freedom. This corresponds to the traditional discipline of metaphysics, so-called special metaphysics, that is inherited from the medieval period. Special metaphysics divides into three different subdomains: philosophical theology, the object of which is God; philosophical cosmology, the object of which is the world as a whole; and philosophical psychology, the object of which is the soul.
And none of these objects are tangible, yet the
Right.
metaphysician will claim knowledge of them nonetheless. But on what basis were metaphysicians claiming knowledge of these supersensual objects?
Well, through the pure intellect, or through pure thought. Say, for example, in Descartes' philosophy, we have an innate idea of God. It's an idea that resides in our intellect. And if we engage in a kind of disciplined method of thought, we can lift this thought in our mind and examine it and scrutinize it and come to know the existence of God anyway, in that way. And in fact, that's first philosophy. I mean, we can't really know anything else except by way of first knowing the existence of God, according to Descartes. And that's pure intellectual knowledge. And he thought you could know the soul in the same way. That's a kind of main project for him in the Meditations, is to show that we know better than anything else. We can attain most certain knowledge of, not of the objects of the senses, but rather of the God and the soul.
Now, Immanuel Kant, he is a seminal Enlightenment thinker. He's also a late Enlightenment thinker. To what extent was he in agreement with Descartes on this point, and in what ways did he diverge?
Well, fundamentally, with respect to what we're talking about, he's attacked these disciplines of rationalist metaphysics. So, in his Critique of Pure Reason, he sets limits, determinate limits to human knowledge, according to which we cannot know whether there's a God or the nature of God, whether there exists an immortal soul, or whether or anything about the size or extent or nature of the world as a whole. So these traditional metaphysical topics, Kant argues in his Critique of Pure Reason that we can't attain knowledge of them. So in that sense, he attacks the whole rationalist metaphysical enterprise.
So he attacks the rationalist metaphysical enterprise, and instead he turns from the objects of metaphysical speculation to the source of those speculations, namely reason itself.
Right, right. He wants to undertake an investigation of reason. In the Critique of Pure Reason, he's concerned with the problems of metaphysics, right? I mean, reason poses these questions about God, about the soul, about the world as a whole, and those questions arise within reason inevitably. I mean, reason can't but pose those questions. But what Kant finds is that reason also can't answer those questions, right? So it's driven to pose those questions, but it doesn't know how to answer them in a way that gains consensus among all inquirers, right? That's the idea that metaphysics can't establish itself as a science, and this is a highly frustrating condition for us, right? I mean, if we could just do as some empiricists might seem to want to do, which is to just stop asking the questions, right? Just expunge these concepts from our science, right? Then we would be able to kind of rest without doing metaphysics. But Kant doesn't think that's possible. He thinks that the questions about what he calls, these God, soul, the world as a whole, those are three different determinations of what he calls the unconditioned. The question about the unconditioned is hidden in our reason itself and cannot be avoided. And so he thinks that what we need to do is to turn back our gaze, as it were, as rational inquirers, back on reason itself to see how these problems arise out of reason in the first place and what resources we might have to come to terms with it. How is metaphysics possible? Is it possible? That has to be the first question, according to Kant. And that's the question of the critical philosophy that is inaugurated with the Critique of Pure Reason.
Ah, yes, the critical Kantian project. Unlike we often talk today about the consensus of the scientific community, but we never talk about the consensus of the philosophical community.
Right.
Because the philosophical community, we always have to keep returning back to this project of critique and of questioning how knowledge is evaluated at all.
Right. Well, I mean, it's an interesting fact. I mean, I think Kant really thought that he could establish metaphysics as a science for the first time. It's a project that Hegel himself also is following up on, and intermediary figures between Kant and Hegel, before Kant and after, up through Hegel. There's this obsession, you might say, with establishing philosophy as a science. But as you say, if the mark of a science is a kind of general agreement on results among the inquiring community, it never succeeds. I mean, for all the brilliance of what's produced through this philosophical efflorescence, its kind of aim of establishing philosophy as a science never succeeds.
But there's still something of value that we can derive from this ambition, I think. Now, these two names that have come up here, Kant and Hegel, these names are basically synonymous with philosophy in many ways. It's fabulous that today we have the occasion to learn something about each, and we're going to do so by discussing your book, Professor, and the title of your book is Hegel and the Transformation of Philosophical Critique. Now, as the title suggests, it's a book about Hegel, but Kant also plays a prominent role in the interpretation you present of the transformation that occurs in Hegel's response to the Kantian project of critique.
Maybe I could say a little bit more about the critical project as Kant kind of initiates it in philosophy. I have said a bit about this already, that he thinks that the first thing we have to do, the first step into metaphysics, is a kind of prior inquiry that's epistemological. We're asking, how is metaphysical knowledge possible for us, right? We have to know that first. And so, and that's really what the critical inquiry is. He calls it in the Critique of Pure Reason a propadoitic, meaning a kind of introductory inquiry. It comes before metaphysics itself, because it's the inquiry in which we're going to establish how and whether metaphysics is possible. And it's also a subjective inquiry, right? Because reason is turned back and examining itself, right? We're examining our own cognitive faculties to know their suitability, as it were, for cognition of the unconditioned, or God, soul, or the world as a whole. So we're asking the question, how is that knowledge possible, prior to undertaking that, to acquire that knowledge? So one way to just express the epistemological problem is, how is metaphysics possible, right? And you asked that question earlier, and I said something kind of vague about, well, it's possible through pure reason, right? It was possible through the pure intellect, but Kant thought that there was a kind of more specific way to conceive of metaphysical knowledge, where it's both synthetic and at the same time a priori. And the combination of those two, being both synthetic and a priori, is something that poses a certain puzzle with respect to the possibility of that knowledge. And so he wants to address that puzzle in the Critique of Pure Reason, and that's what he sets himself to do.
Let's break down those two terms, synthetic and a priori.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's start with a priori first. What kind of knowledge is a priori knowledge?
Well, it's knowledge independent of experience, independent of particular experience. And I mean, the distinction between a priori and a posteriori knowledge goes clear back to the beginnings of philosophy in the West. It's an ancient distinction, and it's basically the distinction between knowledge on the basis of experience and knowledge independent of experience, right? And so when I was what I referred to earlier as kind of knowledge through the pure intellect, that would be a priori knowledge. And mathematics is kind of traditionally conceived of as a domain of a priori knowledge. For Kant, a priori knowledge has two markers that are important. An a priori proposition is universal and necessary, right? And any knowledge that's based upon experience can be neither universal nor necessary. So Kant thought that science had to have an a priori element in order to be science, because it had to have this element as being both a priori and necessary.
So it has to pass the universalizability test.
Yeah, laws of nature, like Newton's laws, they have a universality and a necessity to them that mere generalizations based upon experience don't have, right?
And how about the other component to this formula, synthetic a priori knowledge? What is meant by synthetic in this context?
Well, the distinction between analytic judgments and synthetic judgments is actually Kant's innovation. It wasn't really articulated as such prior to Kant. And an analytic judgment is one in which the predicate of the judgment is implicitly contained in the subject concept. So if you have the judgment, all bachelors are unmarried. It's a classic kind of hackneyed example, but in the definition of the concept bachelor, say as an unmarried male, you already have the predicate concept of being unmarried implicitly thought in the subject concept. And so all you have to do in order to justify that concept is kind of draw out the predicate concept by thinking carefully and fully about what's contained in the subject concept. And so the denial of an analytic judgment is a contradiction. To say of some bachelor that he's married is to contradict yourself. And so the principle of an analytic judgment is the principle of non-contradiction. So logic itself, the principle of non-contradiction, is the kind of justificatory basis of analytic judgments. The Synthetic judgment, in contrast, is a judgment where you attach a predicate to a subject concept that's not already thought in the subject concept. Kant calls such judgments ampliative, right? That you're going outside the subject concept. So any of the ordinary judgments will be synthetic in the sense that the predicate concept is not already implicitly thought in the subject concept. Most of our synthetic judgments are based upon experience, right? We know them by appeal to experience, but that makes them a posteriori, not a priori, right? So we can understand synthetic judgments as grounded in experience. We can understand a priori judgments as grounded in logic. But what about a priori judgments that are synthetic? And Kant thought that these were the most interesting judgments. They were the most fundamental judgments. So he thought that mathematics was synthetic a priori. He thought metaphysics was synthetic a priori. He thought that the most general part of natural science, so Newton's laws, for example, are synthetic a priori. And so there's just a question of how it is that those can be justified. They can't be justified by pure logic because the predicate concept is not implicitly thought. Their denial is not a contradiction, right? Their denial is not a contradiction. So logic doesn't justify them, but neither does experience because there are a priori. So if you take the principle that every event has a cause, as Hume had taught us, there's nothing contradictory in the thought of an uncaused event, right? So we don't know by logic that there can't be events that are uncaused. But still, Kant thought we knew that a priori. It's an a priori synthetic judgment, and the question is, how is it justified?
And so the epistemological discovery here that Kant feels that he's made is answering the question, how is synthetic a priori knowledge possible?
Exactly, right. And the fate of metaphysics rests on answering that question. So he thought that the reason that metaphysics is such a mess, right, that it's a battlefield of endless controversies, you have these conflicting systems and no consensus with respect to the fundamental questions that lie in the very nature of reason that we just can't avoid asking, is because we haven't yet uncovered what kind of knowledge it is and what the problem is that that kind of knowledge poses. And Kant thinks he's uncovered that. And so then that's what the task of the Critique of Pure Reason is to answer that question.
So Kant kind of blows the whistle and says, hey, hold up here, everyone. What are we even doing right now? Let's reset this. And I'm imagining right now a bunch of kids out playing on a playground.
Right.
They're playing 4 or 5 different games and it's chaotic. And then someone comes along and blows the whistle and says, hold on here. We're all playing different games. Nobody even knows the rules anymore. This is a chaotic mess. Let's all decide to play one game. Let's determine what the rules are, and then we can get more out of our playtime experience. I don't know if that is a very good comparison or not, but that's what I was thinking of.
Seems to work for me, right? That we all have to, before we go out and play the game, we have to figure out the rules of the game. There's this prior task that we have to do, and that's what critique is that prior task before metaphysics. That's establishing the criteria on the basis of which metaphysical knowledge could be claimed.
Now, you show in your book very perspicaciously how Hegel's engagement with Kantian critique is both complex and evolving. And it's not at all dismissive, contrary to how commentators have frequently interpreted it, you note. But you also show how Hegel's engagement with Kantian critique is central to how Hegel's own philosophical system developed during his years as a young philosopher and lecturer in Jena between 1801 and 1806. Could you begin to take us through the stages of how Hegel responds to Kant's critical philosophy, beginning maybe with his earlier views on what he took to be the quote-unquote unphilosophical epistemic or critical procedures of his time versus his understanding before writing the Phenomenology of Spirit of the status of metaphysical knowledge and the true philosopher's access to that knowledge?
Sure. So the thing to say about Kant's project from Hegel's point of view is that it ends up in an unsatisfying place, because the way I just described what Kant set out to do is he set out to establish metaphysics as a science by first asking the question, well, what are the criteria for knowledge of metaphysical propositions? But he comes through his inquiry at a place where we can't have knowledge of the unconditioned. So metaphysics turns out to be impossible as rational knowledge of the unconditioned on Kant's picture. So Kant ends up trying to drawing limits according to that which we desired to know is beyond our ken. And this is frustrating for, for a lot of post-Kantian philosophers, not only for Hegel, but also for Hegel. The idea that we're blocked off from knowledge of the absolute.
Mm-hmm. One never attains to the cognition of the absolute after which one strives, you write of this frustration.
Right. And so what Hegel diagnoses as the kind of underlying problem here in Kant is that there's a problem with his whole procedure. This is, I think, something Hegel is referring to at the very beginning of his introduction to the phenomenology of spirit, that the attempt to determine the criteria of metaphysical judgment in a prior subjective inquiry contains implicitly the limits to knowledge that Kant ends up arriving at. So it's basically prescribing our access to the absolute. We're kind of drawing ourselves into a chalk circle, so to speak, of self-consciousness where we can't attain to knowledge of the absolute. So that the method is presupposing its results that in Kant. And I think that's his position, his stance with respect to Kantian critique when he first shows up at Jena, as you mentioned, as a lecturer. At that point, kind of in the shadow of his old roommate from the Tübinger Stift, where they were both educated together. Schelling was a more established philosopher at Jena, which was kind of a hotbed of philosophy at the time, and he's just rejecting the critical enterprise altogether as inherently implying that we can know things only as they are for us, not as they are in themselves, which is Kant's idealism, right? That our knowledge is restricted to the human standpoint.
And so in Kantian idealism, it's the unconditioned that has to conform to the subject's cognitive apparatus.
Right. And
And
in
this,
doing so,
yes.
in conforming, it's no longer the unconditioned, right? Because it's conditioned by us, and so we're knowing it only as it appears, not as it is in itself. We're not knowing the unconditioned, right? We're related to the unconditioned because, in some sense, it's the source of the content of our knowledge, but we can't have cognition of it. Does that make sense?
Yes, and so the idea, the unconditioned goes by a few different names, right? We have the unconditioned, the idea, the absolute, the thing in itself.
Right, exactly. It's confusing how many names get thrown around here for sure. Unconditioned is Kant's name for this object of metaphysics that we're aspiring to. We can't avoid aspiring to know, but we also can never attain knowledge of. That's Kant's name. But in Hegel, it comes to, I think it's essentially the same thing that Hegel's pointing to with different words. The absolute is probably the most frequent word that he uses for it. And it's just, these are different names for what in the history of metaphysics goes by the name of God, right?
And so Hegel's suspicion is a critique initially of Kantian critique is that it's subjectivistic. Everything, the absolute, the idea, the unconditioned, just becomes a function of the subject, and we can never escape this subjectivity. And it's then this subjectivity that sort of posits itself over against the unconditioned, creating a situation of opposition between the two.
Exactly, right.
Hegel, he's closer to his friend Schelling at this point. They're editing a journal together, and You note in the book that in Schelling's system, the unconditioned is known differently than through Kant's system, namely through the intellectual intuition rather than discursively through the understanding. And so this knowledge of the unconditioned, it cannot be demonstrated to what Hegel calls ordinary consciousness. It's only the privileged few have access to it, those who have the intellectual intuition. And so philosophy is a kind of esoteric in this sense. And for Hegel, too, during this period, philosophy maintained this status of being esoteric. It's not communicable to ordinary consciousness. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's. I mean, I think that's an important issue in this period. Is can philosophy be made public, and how can it be made? Can it be made a public possession, as it were, made available to us all, or is it something where if people with who are gifted in some way or another can access the philosophical truth? So I think in Romanticism, in Schelling, that there's at least, I mean, there's more than just flirting with the idea that it's philosophy is the private possession of the few, those who have a special kind of intuition of the absolute, right? But it can't be made available through discursive means, through a kind of demonstration.
So Hegel doesn't necessarily he diverges from Kant because he seems to believe that the Kantian project is rooted. It's grounded in this what he calls ordinary consciousness that falsely bifurcates between the subject and the object.
Right.
Whereas Hegel's idealism, the rational has no opposites. Hegel's idealism, the principle of philosophy is the identity of being and thinking. There can't be a wedge between being and thinking.
Exactly right. This he also shares with Schelling, this idea of the absolute as an identity, and he thinks that Kant's his epistemology and his philosophy of mind is fundamentally dualistic in the way that he conceives kind of knowledge as a relation of representations to their objects, and the objects are distinct from the representations. And so there's a kind of dualism there in cognition where a gulf has to be bridged in knowledge between the subjective representation and the reality, which is the object.
And so this can be seen and is seen by Hegel as a kind of dogmatism, where the essence of dogmatism consists, you write, in positing something finite, something ensnared in opposition, something like the Kantian subject, as the absolute.
Right, right.
Well, I was just going to segue here into the epistemological or the critical procedure that Hegel takes up against this what we haven't called it this yet, but this modern skepticism, this skepticism regarding the objectivity of what we know. And so Hegel rejects modern skepticism as really a crisis in culture, a crisis brought about by the Enlightenment. And instead, he goes back. You have a chapter on this in your book. He goes up to the ancient Pyrrhonists, the Pyrrhonist skeptics.
Yes. What it might be good for me to mention here, I haven't really kind of brought out yet, is Hegel sees his own culture as alienated, as his problem of alienation, which he diagnoses as an alienation between fundamentally between subjectivity and objectivity, right? Subject and object. That dichotomy is structuring the modern culture. And what I argue in the book is that in Hegel's early Jena period, he's reaching back to ancient epistemology to recover the kind of unity of subject and object that he thinks is the philosophical idea, the philosophical absolute. This identity of subject and object, of being and thought, that in the modern period is lost, and it's lost partly because there is this insistence upon the kind of the finite understanding, the I of finite individuals. They're claiming their own standing independently of their relationship to the absolute.
Just to note, this is precisely the standpoint of ordinary consciousness, as
Right,
opposed to philosophical consciousness, which he wants to recover from the ancients.
right, right. So, so this insistence upon the self-standingness of ordinary consciousness is expressed as the impossibility of philosophical knowledge. And he interprets Kant's critical system as the expression of that, right? It's the denial of philosophy in favor of the self-standing nature of individual subjectivity. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yes. And this is a condition of crisis, as we've noted here. The crisis is the standpoint of ordinary consciousness as it's emerged in the modern period, which is the valorization in modern European culture of, as you said, the self standing subject, the ordinary consciousness, over against the absolute. And not only that, but also the dogmatic application in philosophy from Descartes to Kant, Fichte, of the principle of ordinary consciousness, which is the principle of non identity, which for
Right.
Hegel is exactly the opposite of the principle of philosophy. The principle of philosophy for him is the principle of identity. So he is going to go back and write in an article on the relation of skepticism to philosophy about the procedure of the skeptics, which skeptically attacks ordinary criteria of knowledge.
Exactly. So he's reaching back to an ancient um, philosophical procedure, that of the ancient skeptics, because the modern philosophical epistemological procedure is tainted by this dualism. Yes, so that's what I argue is going on there, and it's the idea of a kind of recovery of a model of philosophical knowledge that's ancient, but it's lost in the modern world. And it kind of goes with in that period of in the kind of romantic period of Hegel's development when he's associates with Schelling with a kind of rejection of modernity
Mm-hmm.
in favor of a kind of recovery of this timeless model of philosophical knowing, which is fundamentally kind of Platonic.
Yes, yes, and a rejection of the modern skepticism too, which is being skeptical of our knowledge, capacity to know the unconditioned.
Right, and structured by this kind of ontological and epistemological gulf between the subject and the object. Yep.
He takes the Pyrrhonist skepticism to be infinitely more skeptical than modern varieties. I have a
Right.
quote here. You write that the skeptic's path is not defined as a school, as over against other schools with opposing opinions and beliefs, but as an education to a way of life, which is to say that these ancient skeptics do not define themselves over against philosophy, in opposition to and in competition with it. According to Hegel, ancient skepticism turns against the claims of philosophy only when philosophy itself becomes dogmatic. This happens when philosophers define their principles in opposition to those of other philosophers. That is, when they begin to see themselves as belonging to a school, we could say, which is itself in opposition to the very idea of philosophy, namely philosophy as essentially being one. This is the Platonism in Hegel, I guess, where
Right.
uh, there may be different expressions of philosophy, but insofar as these different expressions get at the essential, eternal, unchanging idea, there is only one philosophy. So if you have philosophy splintered up into a bunch of different schools that have dogmas, well, philosophy has then become dogmatic. What does this skeptical procedure ultimately accomplish?
I think the way Hegel thinks about it most basically is that the skeptical procedure negates all limited claims to knowledge. So it's negative in that sense. Like you said, the via negativity, the via negativa, it's constantly negating particular claims. But ultimately it's leading to something positive at the end of the day, according to Hegel, which is the truth of philosophy, which is not a particular truth, right? It's not a truth that has an opposite, right? As you referred to earlier, it's not one thing among others, but it's the whole. So philosophy is one with skepticism
Yes,
in its
yes.
truth, as he puts it in that early article. So yeah, he sees any kind of philosophy that claims to be a school or a particular philosophy to be in saying that about itself, basically confessing that it's so described, not a true philosophy, because the philosophy must be one, and it must kind of put its face forward as not standing in opposition to other claims.
And that brings us to what criticism is for Hegel in this early Jena period.
Mhm.
Um, Criticism is, as he conceives it during this time, is just the philosophical task of judging what attains to the status of being genuine philosophy and what doesn't. What expresses the idea, like as in criticism of a work of art, right? The work of of philosophical criticism consists in recognizing the universal that's expressed in the particular.
Right.
In which philosophical systems do we catch a glimpse of the idea? Which philosophers were able to think the absolute?
Right, exactly. So Hegel and Schelling are they're putting out this journal that's called the Critical Journal, and what they're conceiving of criticism as being is basically they're going to be talking about different appearances of philosophy, right? It's basically going to be doing reviews, right, of work that's appearing as in claiming to be philosophy, and it's going to be testing that work against the idea of the absolute to see what is true in it and what versus what's false in it, right? And they're going to be. I mean, I kind of like the way in which he talks about criticism here, because he's saying that the true criticism is kind of going to show the truth in what's presented. It's kind of going to kind of refine the presented article and manifest what's true in it, and kind of cut away those parts of it that obscure the presentation of the philosophical idea in it. I mean, it's both positive and negative, but it has this positive upshot.
Distinguish genuine philosophy from what he also calls unphilosophy.
Right.
But philosophical critique ends up getting philosophically transformed by Hegel by the time that he writes the Phenomenology.
Right. Well, let's see. The key thing for me, I mean, what I've argued, is that there's a kind of revolution in his thinking when he's at Jena, wherein he comes to recognize the validity of the epistemological demand that underlies Kantian critique, the demand that, starting from ordinary consciousness and its criteria, we have to be able to kind of lead step by step from there to knowledge of the philosophical principle. Remember that in the early Jena period, he was with Schelling in saying that such a demonstration isn't possible, because the standpoint of philosophical critique presupposes subjectivism, and it presupposes the kind of dualism that is characteristic of the modern period. Um, but he comes to see that uh, this this epistemological demand is grounded in a kind of self-certainty of the individual that's based upon a self-discovery. So philosophy can't swipe it away, can't just dismiss it as an invalid epistemological demand.
There's something essential that has occurred with this modern self discovery.
Right. And I
And
mean, you
so,
could kind of locate this if you wanted to. I mean, not that Hegel does very explicitly, but in the Cartesian cogito, right? A kind of self-discovery of ourselves as self-standing, and such that we have a right to demand rational insight to that which would demand of us our recognition of it. This kind of goes back to your introduction when you were talking about, being critical. Just that sense of being critical, where we teach our students to be critical, right? It's the idea of distrusting authority, and you should always be critical with respect to anything that you read, or what any authorities that present themselves to you. Hegel, I mean, I think Hegel's early Jena period is kind of skeptical with respect to that demand for criticism because he thinks it's bound up with subjectivism.
Mhm.
But he comes to realize that there's that demand of criticism, expressed in that way, is valid. And so we have to, if philosophy is going to demonstrate itself, it has to demonstrate itself. It has to respond to that epistemological demand.
You write that by the time of the phenomenology, in the preface and introduction, as you've just laid out for us, Hegel returns to the Kantian critique, and his return to the Kantian critique turns in great part on his recognition that its epistemological demand is backed by a modern self-discovery. And this recognition is accompanied by a change in Hegel's conception of the nature of the truth of philosophy itself. So Hegel has to come to admit, with this modern self-discovery, that he has to admit the historicity of the idea. So previously he believed that the ambition of philosophy must be to know and to express the idea, or the unconditioned, the absolute, as eternal and unchangeable. In the phenomenology, with his return to Kantian critique via the skeptical procedure of the ancients, he recognizes that this necessarily and equally includes grasping and expressing the historically contingent finite subject as well. So that is, philosophy must in fact satisfy the demand of, quote, the highest right of the subject. In the famous Hegel quote, everything turns on grasping and expressing the true, not only as substance, but equally as subject.
Right. This is the hard Hegelian thought that the truth becomes, right. It's not just as in Plato, or this unchanging reality, but it's a reality that becomes itself through a development, right. And so I'm suggesting in the book that this his kind of coming to recognize that the modern epistemological demand is, as modern, something new and something that must be come to terms with, implies that truth itself becomes, right. So that the philosophy has a history, because I think if you go back to some of those early writings in the early Jena period, he's representing a conception of philosophy as essentially ahistorical, there, and but obviously not in the phenomenology of spirit.
And so in its becoming and its historical unfolding of the idea, this is how we get the condition of opposition and alienation that you described earlier, this condition of crisis, of mutual alienation between ordinary consciousness and philosophical consciousness. And this mutual opposition and alienation, it consists in the absence of a shared or common criteria. So you have the right of the subject to demand demonstration of philosophy's principles, which Hegel now recognizes. And so the question why the project of the phenomenology is necessary, you write, is the question of why this condition of mutual opposition and alienation constitutes a crisis for metaphysics. Why
Right.
is this condition intolerable for philosophy? Why must philosophy come to terms with this opposed unphilosophical standpoint, with ordinary consciousness, with the demands and the rights of the subject?
Well, the seeds for that are contained in things we've already said. I mean, if philosophy's principle, as you quoted from Hegel, where he says the rational has no opposite, so it can't be, it can't have anything that stands over against it, right? Outside of it, the truth is all that is. So there's nothing opposed to it, standing opposite to it. Now, so the basis on which he, in the early Jena writings, can kind of dismiss the epistemological demand expressed in Kantian critique is one where he has to kind of represent it as unphilosophy over against philosophy, right? It can't have any truth in it. But once he comes to recognize that it does have truth in it, right, that the self-standing individual is self-standing, right? That it has it it has a right to make its demand, then philosophy can't be philosophy until it's united itself with that standpoint. That's how he, in fact, puts it in the preface, where he kind of famously represents the phenomenology of spirit as a kind of ladder that leads us up to the philosophical consciousness from the ordinary consciousness. And he says there that it has to philosophy has to reconcile itself with that which stands over against it in order to be what it is. So the phenomenology is going to be the realization of the science of philosophy only through reconciling itself with the ordinary consciousness that stands over against it at the beginning.
Yes. And so the claims of philosophy must, at the end of the day, be made commonly intelligible
Yeah.
as a
Yes.
condition for the existence of philosophy as a science.
Right. Exactly.
And correspondingly, Hegel recognizes our right to make that precisely that demand on philosophy as well.
Right. So we have the right to make the demand upon philosophy that it elevate us to that standpoint. That's really to say that we have a right to press our epistemological demands against philosophy, insofar as philosophy dismisses us as not making a legitimate demand for a demonstration. Philosophy is consigning itself to being, as he puts it, a mere appearance, right? Not being reality. But then philosophy has a right to make a demand upon us as well, as he says in that very same passage, right? And that's where the self-transformational aspect of the method comes in.
Well, in a way, this is what I'm trying to do here with Philosophy for the People podcast, is to exercise the right to demand of philosophy that it demonstrate its principles
Right.
by constructing a path from the standpoint of ordinary consciousness to the standpoint of philosophy.
Right.
Another way of putting it is to say that even if philosophy at first blush appears to be esoteric, if it's ever to truly become what it is, it must be made public. So philosophical science or metaphysics must become exoteric.
Exactly. That's how Hegel conceives of it in the phenomenology of spirit. That it's his conception of philosophy as a science. There is that it has to become public. He says that explicitly.
And so we end up having here a new determination of the work of philosophical critique. You write, Dr. Bristow, quote, this new determination of the work of philosophical critique is critique as the process of eliminating apparent opposition between standpoints through constituting common criteria. And in order to do the work of constituting this criterion, philosophy must submit itself to the crisis. It must surrender its truth and get down on all fours with unphilosophy, so to speak. And in this way alone, philosophy can establish itself in this confrontation as philosophy. So philosophy cannot be content merely to keep its wisdom to itself. That wisdom, it has to be, as we said already, it has to be made public. It has to be accessible by everyone. It has to be universal in that sense. So in this sense, is Hegel admitting to a Kantian criterion of universalizability when he invokes a criterion of common intelligibility?
Yeah, I'm not sure that Kant really conceived of it in this way. The criterion of universalizability in the kind of practical domain for Kant is a process by which you determine whether or not something is a moral duty or morally permissible. I think the way Hegel is conceiving of it here is that it's only through this kind of discipline of responding to this epistemological challenge, which he thinks is, in the way I've interpreted it, he thinks is Kant's epistemological challenge expressed in the project of philosophical critique. It's only through the discipline of submitting to that demand that philosophy's truth gets articulated, right? Otherwise it remains something merely private and inexpressible. But so the truth really becomes articulated only through that process. It becomes something specific. Does that make sense?
It does. And you put it elsewhere that you have to allow the existential crisis to fully flower. And another thing he accuses Kant of is mere formalism, right?
Right.
And so what Hegel advocates is this path of despair, as you put it. It's not just a path of doubt. It's not just the Cartesian style doubt. This is something more involved on the part of the subject, the inquiring subject. So it requires us abandoning our own presuppositions and being willing to engage the subject matter in a more existentially committed way, and to be willing to undergo that crisis ourselves, that crisis of confusion and unknowing and disorientation. And in that process, to, as this new determination of the work of philosophical critique has it, in this process to eliminate or work our way through apparent oppositions between standpoints in order to constitute a common criterion. And this common criteria is what Hegel continued to believe could ground metaphysics as a science.
Yes, exactly. Yes, I think that's the picture, right? So if we, I mean, the way in which he portrays it in the preface, you just imagine, philosophy, um, on one side, and then ordinary consciousness on the other, opposed to each other. And the temptation for philosophy is to just dismiss ordinary consciousness and to say, I'm not going to bother with you. I can't make my truth available to you. You'd know what I know if you just had this intellectual intuition, or if you were gifted in the right sort of way. And on the other side, there's the ordinary consciousness that's it's tempted to kind of say, well, the only truth is the truth that conforms to my understanding, right? And into order to my concepts. And I mean, somewhat crudely, the way Hegel reads Kant is that Kantian philosophical criticism constructs a system out of that standpoint, right? That it's really conformity of the object to the subject that is the ultimate criterion, so that the subject only knows things as it is for it, and the absolute is relegated to a beyond and cannot be cognized. And so Hegel comes to a position where he thinks that the claims of each of these have to be validated, right, in vis-a-vis the other, and so he devises a method of criticism for the phenomenology of spirit, where the ordinary consciousness is going to start subjecting its own claims to truth to criticism according to its own criterion. That's subjecting itself to the crisis, because it has to be willing to have its own standpoint transformed through that process. And that's obviously a difficult process. That's why he calls it a path of despair, right? Because you have to subject yourself to the possibility of self-loss through that process. But philosophy is subjecting itself to a kind of crisis too, because it can either be validated or not validated through that process of criticism. And if it's not validated, then it's not valid. So it doesn't have truth. So that's kind of the picture. So what I talk about in the book is Hegel's effort to describe a kind of criticism that can be genuinely transformational for the one undergoing it.
And you make the point several times that we naturally resist philosophical education.
Right. This is a trope that goes back to Plato, right? That exactly because philosophical education promises to be transformational, it's also threatening, right? And so in Plato's allegory of the cave, you have the unenlightened trying, looking with great suspicion upon their enlighteners, right? And this is obviously referring back to Socrates in Athens, right, who's put to death by his fellow citizens because of the kind of threat posed by philosophy. From looking at it from one perspective, it looks like liberation. Looking at it from another perspective, it looks like self-annihilation. And so, yes, the resistance to philosophy is part of the theme here.
It's really the threat of ignorance, the threat of not knowing.
Right. That's exactly it. The threat is that we would have to fundamentally change, right? And that feels like self-loss. Even though from another perspective, it might look like growth or development, or from the perspective of us in our lives, it looks like self-loss.
Dr. Bristow, thank you so much for being with us today. This has been an enlightening conversation.
Oh, well, thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your careful reading of my book. I appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this discussion and would like to engage the topic in more depth, be sure to sign up for our free weekend seminar starting Saturday, September 5th. The seminar will be held online over a period of 14 weeks and is open to anyone. Just email philosophyforthepeople@gmail.com and you will be automatically registered to receive updates and weekly invitations to our online classroom. Again, that's starting September 5th.
This has been a Solid Work production.
Solid work. Solid work. Solid work. Hey, solid work.